Once upon a time, an ancient Israelite Native American prophet named Moroni compiled 2,700 years of records of his fallen people onto a 60-pound stack of golden plates. He hid these plates in a stone vault on a hill he called Cumorah. 1,423 years later, this same dead prophet returned as an angel to guide a young clairvoyant treasure seeker named Joseph Smith Jr. to the same hill just 3 miles from his house to retrieve these records. On the plates was an ancient dead language that has not been found anywhere else on earth. Joseph translated the strange characters by burying his face in a white stovepipe hat, gazing at a brown egg-shaped stone in the bottom of the hat, and reading aloud the translated words that would glow on the stone's surface by God's power. The plates seemingly weren't necessary to the translation process, and often stayed hidden far out of sight. A scribe would write down the words exactly as Joseph read them off of his stone. When Joseph was done translating, the plates were taken by Angel Moroni, never to be seen again. Joseph knew that people might wonder if the golden plates ever existed at all, so he had 11 of his close friends and family members swear a witness statement saying that they had seen them. They published this statement at the end of Joseph's newly translated All-American Bible and called it the Book of Mormon. This book proved Joseph's newly restored church was the only true church on earth, that Joseph spoke for God, and that all other religions were corrupt abominations that only paid lip service to God. Does this story sound like something someone would make up? Possibly a bit far-fetched or fantastic? Let's look at a few other reasons why the Book of Mormon is likely a work of fiction. The Book of Mormon is written in Elizabethan English. It uses pronouns like thee, thou, thy, thine, and verbs like dost, doth, sayest, and saith. This form of English was used by the King James Bible translators because that's how they used informal English pronouns in 1611. It would have been common English to William Shakespeare or John Milton, but it sounds poetic and otherworldly to our modern ears. People in Joseph Smith's time didn't speak like Elizabethans. If you read Charles Dickens, Victor Hugo, Edgar Allan Poe, or Mary Shelley, you won't find many Elizabethan pronouns or verbs in their novels. Abraham Lincoln didn't use Elizabethan pronouns in his speeches. People at Joseph's time used the same pronouns and verbs that we do today. It goes without saying that Israelites and ancient Native Americans didn't speak Elizabethan English either, so there's no logical reason why this form of English should be found in the Book of Mormon translation. Joseph employed a form of English that was already 200 years out of fashion because he wanted his new Bible to sound like the old one. It was not the result of a translation from an ancient language into the common modern English that he spoke, but an intentional creative choice made by an author who wanted his book to sound and feel biblical. In order to sound as much like the Bible as possible, and possibly to pad out the pages, Joseph copied large portions of the King James translation of the Bible directly into the Book of Mormon. Over 15% of the Book of Mormon text came from the 1769 edition of the King James Bible. This includes translation errors unique to that edition, as well as the italicized words added by the translators for clarity that weren't found in the original text. It would be plausible to find Old Testament quotes in the Book of Mormon, since Lehi's descendants had access to the Old Testament when they left for the Americas. However, these verses should not be word for word identical to the King James translation, or contain scribal insertions from that translation. A translation of the same verse from a different language by a different translator into 19th century English should have a lot of unique differences in wording. Joseph forgot to put things in his own words when he copied King James's homework. Much more damningly, there are dozens of examples of New Testament verses written long after the Nephites' continental separation that somehow made their way verbatim or closely paraphrased into the Book of Mormon. Here are just 40 blatant examples. I'll put a link to them in the description. I encourage you to look them up and compare them for yourself. There is no possible way these New Testament verses find their way into the Book of Mormon without clumsy plagiarism by Joseph or his associates. Portions of Isaiah are believed by scholars to have been written by an anonymous author after the Babylonian exile and are referred to as Deutero-Isaiah. Lehi left Jerusalem before the exile, so he shouldn't have had access to the second portion of Isaiah written after his departure to the Americas. Yet 1st Nephi, 2nd Nephi, and 3rd Nephi all contain these post-exile writings. 3rd Nephi 13:7 contains an erroneous translation made in the 1550s Geneva Bible by Calvinists. The original meaning of the Greek text in Matthew 6:7 was, "When you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do." In other words, don't be thoughtless and long-winded, don't blather on or ramble. Calvinists tweaked the translation to reflect their belief that the vain repetitions of the Catholic prayers were displeasing to God. What is this erroneous 1550s Calvinist retcon of Christ's teachings doing in a verse supposedly written 1500 years before Calvinism? Mark 16 verses 9 through 20 weren't a part of the original manuscripts of the Book of Mark. They were added sometime during the 2nd century by an unknown author, long after Mark's death. They likely shouldn't be included in the Bible, let alone the Book of Mormon. So how did verses 17 and 18, written in the 2nd century in Palestine by a mystery author, end up coming out of the mouth of Moroni verbatim in Mormon 9:24? The obvious conclusion is that Book of Mormon characters are fictional, and that Joseph borrowed their dialogue from the King James Bible in 1829. There are at least 4 samples of Reformed Egyptian characters copied from the golden plates before they vanished into heaven. John Whitmer wrote 7 lines of Reformed Egyptian on a piece of paper now called the Characters Document. The same characters appear on an 1844 broadside advertising the Book of Mormon, and in the writings of 2 of Joseph's scribes. There is no question that these characters were endorsed by Joseph Smith as being language copied directly from the plates. These samples are all that we have to confirm, or debunk, Reformed Egyptian as a language. No linguist has ever recognized these scribbles as being a true language. Charles Anthon described them as
Greek and Hebrew letters, crosses and flourishes, Roman letters inverted or placed sideways, anything else but Egyptian hieroglyphics. The marks in the paper appeared to be merely an imitation of various alphabetical characters and had, in my opinion, no meaning at all connected with them.
John A. Wilson, professor of Egyptology at the University of Chicago, wrote,
"From time to time, there are allegations that picture writing has been found in America. In no case has a professional Egyptologist been able to recognize these characters as Egyptian hieroglyphs. From our standpoint, there is no such language as Reformed Egyptian."
Anthropologist Michael D. Coe, an expert in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican studies, wrote,
"Of all the peoples of the pre-Columbian New World, only the ancient Maya had a complete script."
In other words, Mesoamerican glyphs are the only documented examples of written language in the Americas before Columbus. No parchments, tablets, pottery, or metal plates have been found anywhere in the Western Hemisphere that contain anything resembling Joseph's Reformed Egyptian. The consensus of experts in Egyptian, Mayan, or Hebrew language is that these clumsy scribbles carry no meaning and are not an ancient language. The Book of Mormon text could not have been produced from them. The Book of Mormon claims that the Americas were left empty after the Great Flood, and were repopulated soon after by Jaredites, who came to number in the millions before their complete demise. They were followed by Lehites and Mulekites, who also came to number in the millions. The land was preserved and set apart exclusively for the righteous whom God would lead out of Jerusalem, according to his covenant with Lehi. No other nation could find their promised land or take it from them as long as their covenant was observed. According to that covenant and the Book of Mormon narrative, every migration to the promised land was from the Middle East. The Lehites and Mulekites came from Jerusalem, and the Jaredites came from Mesopotamia following the Tower of Babel narrative. With God's covenant of promised exclusivity in place, there should have been almost exclusively Middle Eastern people and culture in the Americas when Columbus arrived. If the Book of Mormon were true, and if Noah's global flood actually happened, then indigenous Americans should have almost exclusively Middle Eastern DNA. They should speak languages with Semitic traces. They should have a written language that bears some resemblance to Reformed Egyptian or Hebrew. They ought to practice religions or have oral traditions that have strong Hebrew influence. They should be advanced metallurgists capable of working iron, steel, and brass, as described in the Book of Mormon. They should keep domesticated Old World animals like horses, cattle, goats, and swine, and cultivate Old World crops like wheat and barley, according to the Book of Mormon. It's virtually impossible that all of this DNA, language, religion, technology, husbandry, and agriculture would disappear within 1,000 years. And yet, all evidence gathered to date suggests that Native Americans migrated from East Asia via the Bering Strait around 20,000 years ago in several waves. They were never wiped out by a global flood at any point following those migrations. There's no evidence that they ever encountered anyone from the Middle East until after Columbus. Their DNA has East Asian origins. Their thousands of unique languages have no Semitic or Indo-European influence. There are no cultural or religious remnants of Hebrew origin among any indigenous group. There's no evidence they developed steel, iron, or brass work. They domesticated dogs, alpacas, llamas, and turkeys, and kept guinea pigs, deer, turtles, and birds as pets. None of these animals are mentioned in the Book of Mormon, but are featured heavily in Native American creation stories. Nothing in indigenous populations points to Hebrew origins or influence, and nothing in the Book of Mormon aligns with any real-world indigenous culture. Don't just take my word for it. Here's what the scientists have to say.
I'm not aware of any credible genetic or archaeological evidence that suggests there was a migration of peoples directly from the Middle East or Europe to the Americas more than around 1,000 years ago.
The only support for this picture of Native American Old World interactions 2,000 years ago comes from resurrected frauds and distorted history. There is no credible archaeological or genetic evidence to suggest that any Old World peoples migrated to the Americas after the initial incursion from Siberia, prior to the tentative forays of the Norse beginning at around 1000 CE, other than limited contacts between Siberia and the American Arctic.
Scientists have found no evidence of Israelite DNA entering any Native American population during the Book of Mormon period. The simple explanation for this failure is that the Book of Mormon is fiction.
As far as I know, there is not one professionally trained archaeologist who is not a Mormon who sees any scientific justification for believing the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And I would like to state that there are quite a few Mormon archaeologists who join this group.
Today, the Church does not take any official position on the identity or geography of the Lamanites. They altered the introduction to the Book of Mormon because its original claim that Lamanites were the principal ancestors of Native Americans did not align with reality. The migrations and peoples mentioned in the Book of Mormon existed only in Joseph's imagination. If you wanted to find archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon, there's no better place to look than the Hill Cumorah. The Hill Cumorah is a drumlin in Palmyra, New York, that numerous early Latter-day Saint leaders identified as the same Hill Cumorah mentioned in the Book of Mormon narrative. In fact, it is the only positively identified geographical location in the entire book. The Book of Mormon claims that two great civilizations met their end at Hill Cumorah. 2 million Jaredite soldiers and 230,000 Nephite soldiers died at the same hill. Assuming the Nephites were matched in strength by the Lamanites, then roughly the same number died on the Lamanite side, bringing that battle's total to 460,000 men. The Book of Mormon additionally suggests their wives and children died in these battles. So, how many total Book of Mormon people would have died in the vicinity of the same hill? Estimates for the total number of Jaredites varies widely. Among church-friendly sources, I have seen estimates between 6 and 20 million. I'll be generous and assume only 7 million Jaredites died in their final battle. Males over the age of 15 generally represent 37.5% of a population. With the Nephites, Lamanites, Jaredites, and their wives and children all accounted for, there should be at least 8.2 million bodies scattered near the Hill Cumorah. That's 130 Lavelle Edwards stadiums, or 392 General Conference Centers worth of people. There aren't enough pixels in your screen to represent that number of people. This is what 8 million people would look like if you put them shoulder to shoulder and tried to fit them in the same picture. That's how many bodies we are talking about, all piled up at the same hill. So where are the bones? The millions of arrowheads, spears, and swords? The slain war horses? A population of 7 million would require at least 7 million acres of farmland to survive. That's an area the size of Massachusetts. They would need roads and carts and draft animals to harvest and trade food. They reportedly used gold and silver currency and kept swine, goats, oxen, cattle, horses, and donkeys. They built temples, synagogues, and sanctuaries from cement. So where are the cement buildings? The roads? The carts? Where are the bones of millions of non-indigenous Old World farm animals? Where are the millions of gold and silver coins? Where are the pots and pieces of jewelry? How has an area the size of Massachusetts, covered with more than 8 million dead Middle Eastern bodies and their artifacts, gone missing? These artifacts certainly aren't found anywhere near the Hill Cumorah in Palmyra, New York. LDS archaeologist John Clark found,
"Archaeologically speaking, it is a clean hill. No artifacts, no walls, no trenches, no arrowheads. The area immediately surrounding the hill is similarly clean. Pre-Columbian people did not settle or build here. This is not the place of Mormon's last stand. We must look elsewhere for that hill."
Thomas Ferguson, an LDS amateur archaeologist who spent 20 years of his life trying to find the archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon, concluded that,
"You can't set Book of Mormon geography down anywhere because it is fictional and will never meet the requirements of the dirt archaeology."
LDS apologist Terrell Givens admits that
not one single archaeological artifact has been found that conclusively establishes a direct connection between the Book of Mormon and any actual culture or civilization of the Western Hemisphere.
Book of Mormon evidence has not been found anywhere near the Hill Cumorah in Palmyra or any other hill in the Western Hemisphere. It will never be found because these great civilizations and their impossibly apocalyptic battles were pure fantasy. An anachronism is when something shows up in a time period where it doesn't belong. If you were reading a history that was written during the Middle Ages and it began talking about travel by steam engine, that would be an anachronism. You would instantly know that the author actually lived sometime after the 1712 invention of the steam engine, and that they were a very poor historian and a fraud. Such is the case with the Book of Mormon. Horses, mentioned 14 times in the Book of Mormon, went extinct in the Americas 6,000 years ago and were not reintroduced until after Columbus. No horse remains have been found anywhere in the Americas that date to Book of Mormon times. Similarly, elephants or mammoths also died out 6,000 years ago. They are mentioned in Ether chapter 9 verse 19, 3,700 years after they died out. Cattle, oxen, goats, swine, barley, wheat, chariots, iron, steel, and brass are not anywhere to be found in the Americas before 1492. And yet, the Book of Mormon treats them as a normal part of life for an ancient indigenous American. This is because the book was written by a modern European American drawing from his personal life experience rather than actual indigenous American history. In 2 Nephi 3, Lehi tells his son Joseph that Joseph in Egypt prophesied of a future choice seer who would also be named Joseph after his father Joseph. In other words, the Book of Mormon contains a prophecy of Joseph Smith Jr. and the Book of Mormon. The prophecy says Joseph Jr. will be mighty, strong, highly esteemed, as great as Moses, and great in the eyes of God. His enemies would be dumbfounded as he conveyed God's word, bringing the world out of darkness and captivity. He would confound false doctrines, re-establish God's covenants, and restore the house of Israel. The author of this prophecy seemed to have a very high opinion of Joseph Smith Jr. This chapter is a textbook example of the chosen one trope, setting up Joseph Jr. as a long-foretold, inevitable hero with unique abilities and lineage destined to fulfill a great mission. It's clear that the author of this prophecy saw Joseph Jr. as the main character of the story, and of near messianic importance to the plot. In addition to this self-aggrandizing self-insertion, Joseph also repeated one of Joseph Smith Sr.'s visions 3 times in the Book of Mormon. It takes up 1.22% of the book's text. 1 Nephi 8, 1 Nephi 11, and 1 Nephi 15, 21 through 36 contain a vision of the tree of life that perfectly mirrors a vision given by Joseph Smith Sr. when Joseph Jr. was about 5 years old. Joseph's mother, Lucy Mack Smith, recorded her husband's vision in her biography of Joseph Jr. Read it for yourself and see if you think Joseph Jr. may have borrowed a few details. These personal touches in the text betray Joseph's authorship and reveal his Messiah complex. There are numerous errors and inconsistencies in the Book of Mormon text that seem to indicate poor authorship. King Zedekiah, formerly known as Netanyahu, was installed by the Babylonians after they had laid siege to Jerusalem in 597 BC. The Book of Mormon says that Lehi was prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem during Zedekiah's reign, and that he left Jerusalem in 600 BC. In other words, Lehi left Jerusalem 3 years before Zedekiah was made king, and before he was known by the name Zedekiah. If Lehi had left in 600 BC, the king at the time would have been Jehoiakim. Apologists have placed Lehi's departure as early as 605 BC and as late as 596 BC. At 605 BC, Zedekiah would be 13 years old, known as Netanyahu, and his older brother Jehoiakim would be king. It would make no sense for Lehi to reference the first year of the reign of Zedekiah. At 596 BC, Babylon would have already taken Jerusalem, plundered their temple, and exiled or imprisoned thousands. It would not make sense for prophets like Lehi to face ridicule or persecution for predicting the city's future destruction, as they had already experienced Babylonian destruction. No matter where you place Lehi's timeline, things don't add up. Mosiah 21:28 originally identified King Benjamin as the man responsible for translating the records of the Jaredites. However, Joseph later realized that King Benjamin had died earlier in Mosiah 6, so he changed the name to Mosiah in the 1837 printing of the Book of Mormon. The same mistake had been missed in Ether 4:1 and was later corrected by the church. 1 Nephi 12:18 was changed to remove the name Jesus Christ and replace it with Messiah. This is because 40 years later, in 2 Nephi 10:3, Jacob says an angel revealed the name of Christ to him. He wouldn't need this angelic revelation if the name of Christ was already known to his brother Nephi decades earlier. Likewise, Nephi couldn't have known the name of Christ already if Jacob was the one to reveal it decades later. Joseph corrected this mistake in the 1837 edition. Alma 53 and 56 both discuss Helaman's departure with his 2,000 warriors, but there's a 2-year discrepancy between the two accounts. Alma 53 says they left in the 28th year, while Alma 56 says the 26th year. This discrepancy has not been corrected. 2 Nephi 5:15 through 16 suggests that all kinds of wood and precious metals were in great abundance. The next verse says that their temple couldn't be built exactly like Solomon's, because precious things were not to be found upon the land. This seems to be a contradiction. Jacob 2:23-24 says King David's taking of many wives and concubines was abominable to the Lord. Doctrine and Covenants 132 says David's polygamous practices were not sinful. This doctrinal contradiction remains in both texts. Alma 29:4 was changed in 1837 to remove the idea that God's decrees are unalterable. Doctrine and Covenants 56:4-5 says that the Lord commands and revokes as he pleases. Joseph seemed to regret placing restrictions on decrees from God and wanted more freedom to improvise. The original wording has been restored in modern printings, now contradicting section 56. Alma 34:36 and several other Book of Mormon verses suggest that the Lord dwells in the hearts of the righteous. Doctrine and Covenants 130, verse 3, says that the idea that the Father and the Son dwell in a man's heart is an old sectarian notion and is false. These false sectarian notions remain in the Book of Mormon. There are too many inconsistencies in the text to fully discuss here, but taken together, they seem to reveal the work of an inexperienced author. Joseph Smith's first scribe, Martin Harris, had a troublesome, doubting wife, who either hid or destroyed 116 pages of the Book of Mormon translation manuscript. It's possible that she intended to test Joseph's ability to retranslate the same section of the plates. Unfortunately, God forbade Joseph to retranslate them. Fortunately, the Book of Mormon prophet Nephi had made a record covering the exact same time period and events as his father Lehi, though with fewer historical details. Mormon had included both versions of events in his abridgment, despite one being redundant and less historical. Joseph was allowed to translate Nephi's more vague backup record instead of Lehi's, and the problem was almost solved. 2 chapters of Mosiah were lost forever, and some confusion between the Mosiah and Benjamin characters had to be ironed out later, but the Book of Mormon project had been put back on track. Why did Nephi make a record covering the same events as Lehi that contained fewer historical details? Why did Mormon include both records in their entirety, rather than abridging them into one? What are the odds that both of these irrational, time-consuming decisions would pay off more than 1,000 years later when a foolish man handed his antagonistic wife 2 months' worth of work that God wouldn't allow him to do a second time? The explanation the Book of Mormon gives is that God, having foreknowledge of Lucy's betrayal, inspired these men to go to twice the effort so that there would be a backup record after Joseph and Martin squandered the first one. God could have saved everyone a lot of trouble by just warning Joseph of what Lucy planned to do, but instead made 4 men work on the same ultimately useless record. An alternative explanation is that Joseph knew that his memory wasn't good enough to reproduce the 116 pages, and that his lack of translation abilities would be exposed if he tried. So he instead made a loose approximation of the same story, and invented an explanation for why it wouldn't match the first account. This is a story of a con man's improvisation under pressure, not of miraculous prophetic foresight. The Book of Mormon stories that your teachers taught to you are not true. An inventive confidence man, inspired by religious revivals and mound builder myths, saw an opportunity to make money, to make a name for himself, to gain power and influence over the gullible and superstitious, to have extramarital affairs sanctioned by God, and to impersonate God whenever he wanted something from his followers. The novel he produced is not historical, nor divine, nor engaging. Only those most invested in it being true find any value in its words. It's a racist and false origin story for Native Americans that explains how their dark skin is a curse from God that makes them filthy, loathsome, and revolting, and that only joining the Mormon Church can release them from the curse and make them white and delightsome once more. Its canonized racism is an embarrassment to anyone tasked with defending it. 200 million copies of the Book of Mormon have been distributed by the Church, and nearly as many copies have been thrown in the trash where poorly written, plagiarized, racist fiction belongs.